welcome our video audience. Good to have you with us today. As always, a special welcome to my peers who were with me at the Regional Center meeting yesterday. It's good to have you with us. It's amazing how people want to hear about Bathsheba. But Bathsheba is kind of a prop today. What I really want to talk about is how we handle it when people we respect, our leaders sometimes, become disloyal to their families and to their spouses. And that's what I want to talk about. That's happened several times, and every time it happens to me, I think, wow, I just don't know what to do about this. You know, one of my favorite theologians, Karl Barth, he was, I think, the brightest theological mind of the 20th century. He's primary author of the Barmen Declaration, which was a declaration in Germany when Hitler was coming to power, saying, no, we're not going to support the Christian movement of Nazis. And yes, they had a movement in there, and a lot of churches did support the Nazis. But Barth was the author of this declaration that said, no, we're not going to do that. And thousands of churches signed up for it. What happened was, of course, he ended up exiled. He ended up finishing his days in Switzerland, teaching at the University of Basel. One of the students he had was John Hesselink, who was president of Western Seminary when I was a student there. So I got to study under somebody who studied under Barth, which was kind of cool. Well, I found out just in the last 5-6 years or so that Karl Barth had a long-term affair with his assistant, that he wrote this huge theological tome called Church Dogmatics, 13 volumes, about 500 pages each of fine print, and I read them all. But he didn't finish it. And the reason he didn't finish it was because his assistant had gotten dementia, and so he just quit. But he'd had this long-term affair. I didn't even believe it at first until his kids came out with a correspondence between him and his assistant. And then a few years back, quite a few years back, when I was still living in South Dakota, Senator Gary Hart from Colorado was the front runner on the Democratic ticket. And everybody, all the Democrats in South Dakota, and there's 4 of them, they were convinced that Gary Hart was going to be the one to take down George Bush. Well, he was much more popular. But then the news came out he was having an affair. There were pictures of him with his girlfriend on a boat called Monkey Business, was on the cover of all kinds of magazines. So he dropped out of the race. And my reaction was, oh, come on. And then Bill Clinton. Need I say more? And I was sorely disappointed. Not only was he disloyal, but he lied about it to Congress. He was a leader of the free world. I expected better. And then there's Bill Hybels, pastor of a mega church, Willow Creek Church, was on the southwest side of Chicago. Was at one time the largest church in the United States. He had set his retirement date to be October of a few years back. 6 months before he was going to retire, several women on his staff came forward and said, this guy coerced us into an inappropriate relationship. So his response to it was, no, I didn't. And then he resigned and just disappeared, which is an interesting response to that. Now, I admired him. A lot of the things I've done because of his teachings. This building is following the design of his people. And I was so disappointed. And even though I'm a very thrifty Hollander, I threw away all of his books and CDs. Now, I don't know how you handle it. Somebody you respect has a moral failure. Somebody you respect is disloyal. So the question that I want you to think about is, does personal disloyalty reflect on leadership ability? And what do we do with it when it happens? Do we forgive? Do we forgive but disqualify? Should leaders who have moral failures be disqualified? And perhaps more importantly, how do you handle your own discouragement when you see this happen? So as I said earlier, we're going to tackle an R-rated story in the Old Testament today as an example of this. We're going to look at a story of a leader who really blew it. It's the story of David and Bathsheba. And you can see from the slide, there's a movie made in the 50s of David and Bathsheba, but they look like 1950s American people, not like 1000 BC Jewish people. David would have never shaved his face. That was a disgrace. Real men don't shave, in those days, and some people say so even now. But it was just one of those things back then, and of course, I doubt Bathsheba could have looked like that, but I don't think they did their historical research very well. The story comes from the book of 2 Samuel, chapters 11 and 12, and you need to remember the context here. Women were no more than livestock or pets. Women were owned by men in those days, and they didn't have any say in anything. Okay, they were just there. Now, David was the king, and it was springtime. Oh, and I just need to back up a little bit. Most of the men had more than one wife, especially if you had money, if you had property, because so many of the men were killed in battles. They went out and were killing each other right and left to, territorial wars and whatnot. It's the Middle East, still that way today. So they would purchase these wives and have children with them. Now, it was springtime, and that's when the kings usually led their particular group of troops out to war. And the Israeli troops were fighting the Ammonites at that time. However, David decided not to go to the front. Normally, the king went there and did that as a morale booster for the troops, but he didn't. He stayed back. As the story goes, he was taking a nap, middle of the day. He woke up from his nap, went for a walk on the rooftop of his palace, and from the rooftop of his palace, he looked down and saw Bathsheba, whose name means daughter of Sheba, and she was taking a bath. And he liked what he saw. And since he was the big dog, he said, I can have her. So he sent for her. Now, the passage also tells us that she was at the end of her purification rite. Those of you who know about Jewish history, you know that Jewish women, especially the Hasidic Jews, the conservative Jews today, still practice this, where the first day of your cycle, you stop having any relationship with your husband until the 14th day. And then you can get together again. Now, any gynecologist or obstetrician will tell you that's the day you are most likely to conceive. So that's, what the Jewish belief was and still is with some parts of Judaism. So this was the time that David saw Bathsheba taking a bath. He sent for her. And guess what happened? They did not go to Starbucks for coffee. Okay? Bathsheba gets pregnant. And there was a day when a pastor said the word pregnant in church, he got yelled at. But it's okay now. The problem was with Bathsheba, so she was married. And she was married to a high-ranking officer in David's army named Uriah. Those of us who grew up in the 70s know the band Uriah Heep. That's the same name. So Uriah is summoned by David, and David says, go home, hang out with your wife. Because he wanted, they didn't have paternity tests in those days. He was hoping that he'd go home. Uriah says, no, I'm not going home. All my men are out there on the battlefield. I'm not going to go home. David took him into the palace and got him drunk, and he still wouldn't go home to his wife. You can see where it'd make a good movie. So then what happens is David says, to his other officers, put Uriah in the front lines and then let the battle get going really hot and heavy, and then you all back off so that Uriah gets killed. And that's what happens. The story comes, as I said, from 2 Samuel chapter 11. This is kind of a summary paragraph of it. It says, when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. So there's a kind of a lead pastor of the nation of Israel, a prophet by the name of Nathan. And Nathan hears about all this from God directly, according to the story. Nathan goes to see David. And he says to David, I got to tell you a story, which, all good preachers do. And he started telling him the story about a poor man who had one little lamb that was kind of his pet. He said the lamb ate with him, slept with his children. He didn't have much, but he had this pet lamb. Well, there was a rich guy next door who had thousands of sheep and cattle and horses and whatnot. And the rich guy was having some guests over, so he sent his people to go get the pet lamb from the poor guy, and they ate that lamb for supper. Okay? So Nathan tells David this story and says, what do you think? And David is furious. He says, bring that guy out, I'm going to have him executed. No way we're going to have that in this kingdom at all. And then Nathan looks at David and says, you are that man. And then David confesses and repents, we think. Now, according to tradition, Psalm 51 was written by David as a song right after this happened. So we're going to take a look at Psalm 51 now. It reads like this. Have mercy on me, O God, because of your unfailing love, because of your great compassion. Blot out the stain of my sins. Wash me clean from my guilt. Purify me from my sin. Now, why do you suppose he repented? Because he got caught? What if he hadn't gotten caught? He repented because he wanted to change. Or maybe both. We don't know. Here's how his little confession goes on. For I recognize my rebellion. It haunts me day and night. Against you and you alone have I sinned. I've done what is evil in your sight. You will be proved right in what you say, and your judgment against me is just. Well, that's not true. It wasn't just against God that he had sinned. I'm certain Uriah didn't think he was all that innocent. And I'm certain he hurt Bathsheba. But all the people he was leading, a couple million of them by that point, he let them all down too. And now look at what he says. This is almost audacious. He says, for I was born a sinner. Yes, from the moment my mother conceived me. But you desire honesty from the womb. Teach me wisdom even there. Look at that. I was born a sinner. So God, it's not my fault that I did this. It's your fault because it's how you made me. See, he's trying to pass the buck to God on this. Say, I can't help it. You made me this way. What do you expect? It's not my fault. It's your fault. And then he goes on. Purify me from my sins, and I'll be clean. Wash me, and I'll be whiter than snow. They made hymns about this. Oh, give me back my joy again. You have broken me. Now let me rejoice. Yeah, sure, David. It's all about you. You notice he doesn't mention the people he hurt. He certainly hurt Uriah and Bathsheba, but he's interested in getting his joy back. Interesting, isn't it? He doesn't mention the disappointment he caused. He just wants to feel good. Verse 9. Don't keep looking at my sins. Remove the stain of my guilt. Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Now, I like that last line, renew a loyal spirit. Some versions translate that as steadfast. And I think there's a big significance to loyalty in all human relationships. And to hear David say he wanted that, he wanted loyalty even though he had a track record of disloyalty. Now, creating loyalty in a person is probably not something that God is going to do alone. God won't make you loyal. He'll remind you that's a good thing to be loyal, but each of us has to do that on our own by making small commitments and keeping them. And God participates in it. But we have to decide to be loyal. It goes on like this. Skip down to verse 17. The sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. You will not reject a broken and repentant heart, O God. See, God does forgive. The ironic thing is that David and Bathsheba, this child that was conceived here dies, but then she gets pregnant again and gives birth to Solomon, who's the next king. And they are the biological ancestors of Jesus. So isn't that interesting? Of all the people in the world that God could have chosen to be ancestors of Jesus, he chooses David and Bathsheba. That to me is really interesting. There are consequences, however, when we are disloyal. God forgives, but there are consequences. For David, he had huge family problems. His sons, daughters, there's rape and incest in his family, all nasty stuff. Suicides, all kinds of nasty things. If you ever want some good R-rated stories, read 2 Samuel in the Bible. What are you reading? The Bible. But they really do have some good stories in there. And, the thing is, here's David, he was disloyal. What do we do when someone we look up to is disloyal? See, and if you're a follower of Jesus, forgiveness is not optional. We have to forgive those who repent, and we need to forgive those who don't repent. But there's a huge difference between forgiveness and trust. And oftentimes we confuse that. That doesn't mean we trust them. Should we trust David? No, well, maybe we can after a few years. You never know. I like to illustrate this with cars. I'm going to the Chicago Auto Show tomorrow. Fired up about that. This is my garage from about 15 years ago or so. And that blue car there, my dad bought it new. And he drove it to Arizona. About 30,000 miles on it, the transmission went out, still under warranty. He had the transmission replaced in Arizona. By the time he got back to Sioux Center, it needed another transmission. And it would never start. We had to keep a screwdriver in the door to bypass the solenoid to get it started. And it leaked oil, and every year we had to put a new alternator or a new starter on it. So as soon as it went out of warranty, my dad asked if I wanted to buy it. I said, sure, what do you want for it? He said, $10. Sold. Can't even buy a tire repair for that. So I think he was laughing as I drove away with it. But I drove it out here, and I drove that car for 4 years. Average maintenance cost $110 a month for 4 years. It was the most expensive car I've owned as far as that. That little white one sitting next to it ran just fine, never had a lick of trouble with that. Now, here's the thing. Without saying any names of any corporations, I called the manufacturer and told him about the troubles, and the guy said to me, son, which them's fighting words right there. He said, son, every car wears out. And we can give you a real good deal on a new one if you want to come in. I said, no, I don't want another one. Now, I can forgive the manufacturer. I think I have. But I don't trust him. Now, if they start making reliable cars and get a track record of that, I'd reconsider. But not yet. If someone is disloyal to a spouse, chances are they're not going to think twice about being disloyal to you. If a political leader is disloyal in their most intimate relationships, do you think they will hesitate to be disloyal to their country? I don't think they will. Now, forgiveness is a given, especially for followers of Jesus, but trust has to be earned. And folks, you are not bad people if you don't trust. You're cautious and you're wise. Now, if David walked in here today, and maybe he can hear me talking now, I don't know. But if David would walk in here today, I wouldn't do business with him. I wouldn't trust him because of his track record. And the best book on this, I think the most logical one, is this one. I've recommended it many times, Necessary Endings by Henry Cloud. And Henry Cloud is, I think, the top psychologist in the world today. He's definitely my favorite. So, here's what we're going to do. If you have been disloyal, what do you do about it? Well, first thing is to repent. And repent means to turn around, to stop doing what you were doing. Second thing is take responsibility for it. Admit it's your fault. If Bill Clinton had just simply said, yeah, I did it, and I made a mistake, I would have respected him a lot more. Take responsibility for your stuff, whatever it is. Own it. And then forgive yourself. Most difficult thing a lot of Christians have. I hear about it in hospitals all the time. People are afraid they're going to be dying, and you have this natural sense of all the things you've done wrong in your whole life. Jesus forgave you, so forgive yourself. And then start building trust by making small commitments and keeping them. And then you will find that trust is rebuilt slowly. It's not going to happen overnight, but it does happen. And then if you have encountered disloyalty, if you've been on the receiving end of disloyalty, here's what you need to do. First one is to forgive. It's difficult, but it is possible. And what forgiveness means is you're just not going to hold it against them anymore. Doesn't mean you have to, buy their cars or trust them with anything they say, but you just don't hold a grudge against them. And as you're doing that, remember that we all have skeletons in our closets. As I was thinking about this, I went to get a coat out of my closet, and it's such an incredible mess. There's no room for a skeleton in there. But the thing is that we all do have skeletons in our closets. And then the next thing is just be cautious. Just because somebody says they're sorry doesn't mean they're sorry. And so you got to watch and you got to wait and make sure that their behavior backs what they're saying. And then be open to trust again. That's a tough one for me. I have trouble trusting somebody once they've ripped me off or once they've been disloyal. I have trouble with that. We need to be open to that. And then remember this too. You're not a bad person if you can't trust. Sometimes that's the most wise thing to do. So I want to summarize this today with this picture. I expect fully to hear stomachs growling in the next 2 to 3 minutes. But everybody most people like a good steak. I know I do. And my own stomach just is starting to move a little bit here. I'm feeling moved. Anyway, when you get a steak like that, you have to eat around the bone. You can't eat the whole thing because it's got a bone in it. There's T-bone in there. But the steak's still good. And just like there's good in all humans, there's the image of God in all humans. Just don't do business with the parts that aren't good. It's really quite simple. I think that we can rejoice and enjoy the fact but there is good in all people, and move forward in trying to heal the hurts that have been caused by those who've been disloyal. So to our video audience, thanks for tuning in. Next week, my title is Heroes in the Hood. We're going to be talking about the Good Samaritan story from Luke 10, and we'll see you next time.